Righty-ho, we're going to restart, and we're going to restart with, well, one of those difficult ones. I'm very amused by the fact that this has been entitled, We Need to Talk About Diesel. It is, I suppose, a conscious echoing of Lionel Shriver's wonderful novel, We Need to Talk About Kevin, which, if anyone has read that novel, ends with Kevin slaughtering the entire family. The thinking of the novel being we should have talked about Kevin a long time ago because Kevin is going to kill us all. Anyway, so we need to talk about diesel. Well, one of the key underlying themes, I guess, about our discussions now is whether or not the same is true of diesel as it was of Kevin. We have a very good and, again, multifaceted group of people to discuss it all. On the end there, Sophie Power, who's the CEO and co-founder of Air Labs, and this is a technology, a revolutionary technology that removes, I was going to say reduces, it actually removes, doesn't it, nitrogen dioxide and other urban pollutants as well from engines. So very interesting to hear her perspective on that. We also have, an interesting kind of, well, I was going to say a politician's, but a former politician's perspective, but also the perspective of someone who has been in the business of making the rules about this and other kind of ecological issues. Mike Rann, who's next to Sophie, was the former Australian High Commissioner to the UK, but he was also Premier of South Australia for nearly a decade, so he actually knows what it is like to kind of set the rules about all of this. Edmund King, on my immediate left here, is president of the AA and represents, a very important part, obviously, of the stakeholders, as we must call them in the modern terms, of those who are going to make the actual decisions about what happens to diesel. In other words, the people who are at the moment buying diesel cars, though we hear there aren't quite as many of them as there once were, and the extent to which they're going to be persuaded to or persuade themselves to carry on buying them in the future. And that obviously is going to be absolutely central to the whole business of whether we have them in the future or not. Quentin Wilson on my right, motoring journalist, author, TV presenter, I think it's fair to say campaigner as well, behind the Fair Fuel campaign, but also a campaigner for greater investment in electric and in hydrogen vehicles as well. He's actually held his own green motor show, not a one-man green motor show. I made it sound as if it was just you, but people came. Yeah. He held it and people came. Anyway, so welcome as well to him. Ian Gray from Jaguar Land Rover, Senior Manager, Powertrain Advanced Controls, and that, of course, is, well, has a very obvious bearing on what Jaguar Land Rover think themselves about what the future of diesel is. And that's going to be something that we definitely get to and get back to. And then Simon on the end there, Simon Burkett, founder and director of Clean Air London, who I sort of assume is not a huge fan of diesel in any way, shape or form, but we shall find out. So that's our panel. Once again, if anyone wasn't here last time, this machine worked rather well, actually. So do get questions going. Anyone at any stage who wants to ask anything, they pile up here and we can put them to our panel as our discussion carries on. So, Ian, first of all, what is Jaguar Land Rover's view of diesel?
So, fundamentally, when you look at the technology that a diesel engine can provide in today's technology, we're looking at an engine that can achieve comparable level of NOx emissions compared to a petrol engine, but will consistently deliver 20 to 25% better fuel consumption, and that means lower CO2. So when we look at today's Euro 6 diesel engines, which are set up with after-treatment technology, so in our vehicles we use selective catalytic reduction and diesel particulate filters. So the combination of those two reduce the NOx emissions and reduce the particulate emissions to a point where actually you can be confident that you're driving a clean diesel and that you're driving a car which also delivers a significant fuel economy benefit. when you consider that we have to look at both the global warming picture and the localized air quality picture, the combination of those two things together means that the diesel engine is absolutely a valid choice. But one of the key things from our perspective is we are engineering petrol solutions, diesel solutions, fully electric solutions, and announced this morning, of course, that all of our petrol and diesel versions will be hybridized in the future as well. So we are engineering the sort of full gamut of systems to allow the customer the choice, to make sure that the customer can buy the car that's right for their particular kind of.
And you're convinced, are you, as a company, that there are enough customers who still want diesel and will still want diesel in 5 years, 10 years' time?
Fundamentally, there are customers whose use profile, use cases far better suit a diesel engine than a petrol engine or a electric system. And in those conditions, the diesel is absolutely the right solution.
Simon.
Well, after the previous session on the electric switch and the announcement this morning, perhaps I can retire. But more seriously, diesel is the devil and we do need to ban it. The more complex question...
Could you just be a little clearer about it?
Well, what a great opportunity to... but it is what I believe. Diesel is the devil and we do need to ban it. The more complex questions are which vehicles, where, when, and how. Which vehicles, when, where, and how. That is much more complicated. That is about providing the infrastructure, doing the sort of things that Jaguar Land Rover is taking a lead on today. It's about some bans, some charging, some public education campaigns, some incentives. And as Edmund tweeted this morning, we're already finding that there are a lot fewer people that would choose a diesel vehicle as their next vehicle. So that's how I would start off.
I'm planning to get back on that. I'll let you come in a second. Quentin, from the point of view of people who currently own diesel cars and listen to those two opinions, what are they to make of things?
Well, they are confused, deeply confused, and you can understand why. And they've had £35 billion wiped off the residual value of their cars because of the Dieselgate hysteria. And I think you're absolutely right, Simon, when you say that this is a very complex subject. And those older cars that pollute the most need to be sanctioned off the roads pretty quickly. We've got 7 million pre-2008 diesel cars out there. These are the cars without diesel particulate filters who emit vast amounts of particulate matter and NOx. And then when you look at the older, worn-out diesel engines within that 7 million car segment, that's not being measured at all. The government's been completely remiss in not telling us, how much particulate matter these vehicles get out. So you've really got to look at it in a broad way. And consumers really don't know what to do at the moment. And the government really does have to start looking at all the different sources of diesel pollution that are affecting our air quality, because it isn't just cars. I mean, they are the older segment, yes, they contribute quite significantly to background emissions in London. But as you said, the Euro 6 diesels, with this chemistry set underneath the car of catalytic converters and DPF filters, these are really modestly clean now. They're not completely clean, but they really have gone forward. So we need to look at this older car park, but we also need to look at central heating, which is 30% of particulate matter. Argas, wood-burning stoves, ridiculous though it might sound, I mean, that's a huge proportion of particulate matter in London's air. Trains, buses, 16% of particulate matter and nitrous oxide in the centre of London from the 8,000 diesel buses that the TfL fleet runs. And German environmental research this week came out with this really quite jaw-dropping figure that one large cruise ship emits in a single year the same amount of diesel emissions as 1 million cars. So we really do need to look at this on a wide basis and say, if we don't, then we risk not making a difference. You can ban cars, you can restrict car use, you can drive them off the road, and then not make a significant difference to London and the rest of the city in the UK's air. If you took all the diesel vehicles out of London, and this is a King's College London statistic, if you took all diesel vehicles outside London, you would only affect particulate matter by 2.5%. And it is the particulate matter, Simon, isn't it? The PM10s, the PM2.5s, the PM1s, the ultrafine particles that are causing the health issues that we're so worried about, that are in the bloodstream, that are in the lungs. And that's what we've got to focus on. How do we properly, thoroughly clean our air?
We'll get back to that in a second. Edmund, the AA's perspective, or your perspective.
Well, in our perspective, we feel sorry for the consumer because there's been so much disinformation, hysteria, and the wrong signals given out. If you go back to 1998, 2001, it was green groups pressing for diesel. It was the European Commission pressing for diesel. It was the government pressing for diesel, giving incentives, fiscal incentives for people to buy diesel cars. And people did. They followed that advice. And then it's some years later, they're told that they are the devil and diesel is demonized. And there's all conflicting arguments. If you look at London at the moment and the plans for the future, 8 out of 10 drivers are concerned about air quality. So it's not that they're not concerned. But the array of things that are coming in are so confusing. You've got a congestion charge. We're going to get a T charge, a toxic charge. There's already in Westminster a D charge. What's a D charge? When you go to pay for your parking, if you happen to have a diesel, even if it's a brand new Euro 6 diesel, you have to pay £2, £75 more for a D charge. Then we're going to have a low emission zone and then an ultra low emission zone. So people are confused. They don't really know. And yet, there are some cars that are better for some people and some journeys. If you live in a town centre, a diesel is not for you. An electric car, a hybrid, a fuel-efficient petrol car is better. But if you live outside Milton Keynes and do 500 miles a week on the motorway constantly, then a good Euro 6 diesel is better for you. So I think rather than the hysteria about every vehicle, there was a Professor Donald Stedman from Denver University, Colorado, came to London with his remote sensing equipment. What Stedman found was that 10% of the gross polluters cause more than 50% of the problem. So target that 10%. Get that 10% off the roads immediately and then gradually transform to greener, cleaner vehicles.
Can I just add there that it is, to me, utterly amazing that the MOT test does not measure particulate matter from exhausts. And if you are to measure particulates, the MOT man will fail your car if you can't see out the back window, if it restricts the visibility, and I'm not kidding.
That's rough and ready.
Yeah, so, governance of this area has been woeful. So the government needs to step up and do that as well.
Damn politicians, Mike.
Look,
Useless bunch.
I have to say, it's very easy to beat up on the car companies, and everyone is. There's a competition amongst politicians around Europe and around the world to pile into the car companies because VW's deceit has given them permission to. That's, of course, a diversion, and Edmund pointed to that, from the fact that after the Kyoto Protocol Treaty in 1997, all of us around the world were told you've got to cut CO2 emissions, which we did, or started the processes of, and in Europe led the charge. Whilst the Japanese and Americans went towards hybrids and electricity, an agreement was made with the European Commission, strongly supported by the British government, to push people towards diesel. Diesel at that stage was 10%. 1995, I think it was. It moved up to over 50%. So, it was the politicians who wanted to do something and be seen to do something about climate change who pushed everyone, incentivized them with price points to go towards diesel. And of course now those same politicians, some of them are still the same politicians, are whacking the car companies. And I think you've got a serious problem in London. I live here now. The day I left to emigrate as a little boy, it was one of the worst smogs in British history. We had
handkerchiefs around our faces which turn sort of black, brown and yellow. But, you know, and the Clean Air Act was applauded internationally here, but there's a serious problem in London that anybody who lives here knows about. And so I thought Jaguar Land Rover's announcement today was fantastic, but there are 365 schools in London where the kids go to school and the pollution levels are higher than health standards would allow legally. So there's a problem, but I think we should look at the emissions, not just the technology. And I'll just finish up on that. When I turned my state from 0, and it's now renewable energy, and it's now 50% in 15 years. But rather than banning coal-fired power stations built, you know, in the future, them being built, what we did is basically set the toughest emission standards. There are now no coal-fired power stations, but you should look at the emission standards rather than going for saying, let's ban this or that, and then have even more unintended consequences.
So you're not a fan of controls on certain people arriving in town and certain types of diesel and all that kind of stuff that we're very much looking at?
My view is that what Jaguar Land Rover doing, which is moving to electric and hybrid, makes sense because of the point made about longer journeys. So I mean, it's a transitional thing. But what we're seeing, I mean, the debate at the moment with the car companies, the debate is is between credibility and technology. And there's an election in Germany on the 24th of September, and diesel and immigration are the two biggest issues.
Yeah, which is fascinating. Sophie, can you fix it? I mean, not the German election, but the diesel emissions.
I mean, I think we're realists. And when you look at nitrogen dioxide emissions, and we look at all of them pretty much as the same, only 5% come from diesel cars in central London. There's another 45% that come from other vehicles, and another 50% that we're doing far less about that come from other sources, as Quentin alluded to. So we've been focused on the people. What we're really concerned about is the effect of nitrogen dioxide on people's health. And Air Labs, as you mentioned, we developed the first proven technology to effectively remove nitrogen dioxide from the air. We've been installing the first ever clean air zones protecting pedestrians, a clean air bench off Oxford Street, clean air bus shelters. But our recent research has shown that actually people's greatest exposure during their day is when they're driving their car. And the levels of nitrogen dioxide inside your car are much higher than they are outside. Yeah. So even if you're driving a lovely electric car, you've been very virtuous, you're not emitting, the air quality inside your car is whatever's on the street, but it's also the exhaust of the vehicle in front of you. So you're stuck behind that TfL bus, you're stuck behind that taxi, you've got very poor air quality. So our focus as a company is to reduce exposure to nitrogen dioxide, to particulate matter. And next month, we're now launching a consumer product that you can now put inside your cars and for the first time actually protect yourself, your children. If you've made this decision to have an electric car, even if you have an old diesel car and you're misled by the government, you can now protect yourself. So that's what we're doing. The clean air zones, we want to start working with schools as well to protect them. But in short, we don't think there's a problem going away anytime soon. And our focus is giving people the ability to protect themselves, and especially their children and long-distance workers and drivers who spend a lot of time in their cars.
Simon.
I'd like to pick up on a few points, and I'll do it very quickly. Quentin made several great points, but one was about all sectors needing to play a part in this. A lot of other sectors are well on the way to it. There are no new coal-fired power stations being built in Europe. They're being shut down. The Climate Change Committee is assuming that there will be no wood burnt within the gas grid within about 15 years. So other sectors are getting on with this, and I think that's important.
Shipping needs to really move.
Shipping is another one. Edmund's point, the mayor needs to replace the congestion charge, T-charge, ULEZ, LEZ with one simple scheme. I've called it, designed it actually with Isabel Dedring, Boris's Deputy Mayor for Transport, on the back of an envelope called emission-based road charging. It just says, are you in inner London or outer London? Is it peak hour or not peak hour? What is the quantity and quality of fuel burnt? So if you just drive a little bit, you're not going to pay anywhere near as much as someone driving a big, dirty diesel vehicle around a lot. Who's to blame for this? It actually goes back further than 98. There's an investigation that I published on cleanair.london, which blames Maggie Thatcher fairly and squarely for this.
Always her fault in the end.
Well, it's every single government since. Norman Baker, for the Lib Dems, stood in an event and said, I'm not going to do anything which makes CO2 even a smidgen worse. That was at a policy exchange event. The Conservative Party or the Labour Party did its bit, but that was actually Gordon Brown incentivising diesel when it had plateaued, after the sales had plateaued after Maggie Thatcher's.
But should they have known, and if you're going all the way back to Thatcher's time, should they have known the harm that was potentially going to be?
They knew. They knew.
Because there's no question in your mind at all.
If you look at the 98 budget, you will see a little footnote saying that we understand that there will be a deterioration of urban air quality, but because of the CO2 benefits, this is acceptable. So absolutely they knew. And the Americans said, what are you doing?
Well, the Americans set technology neutral standards, as we've heard, which basically said this is what comes out of the exhaust pipe. Here, they knew exactly the position. You read the environment strategy that was published in September 1990, it sets it out and it bets that, or hopes that, technology will maybe solve it. But I must say, there's one thing I really must say. There's a very important quote in a John Vidal article about air pollution, where he quoted a very senior civil servant who said they knew exactly what they were doing, and in effect, we decided to kill people sooner rather than later.
Just on the subject of the technology then, answer Quentin's point about Euro 6. So can you not draw a line and say, if you're driving Euro 6, particularly if you're driving fast outside cities, long distance, you are not, in that case, damaging people at all?
Well, we need to distinguish between cities and rural areas. That's the most important thing. King's College say that many roads in central London will tend to have the highest levels of nitrogen dioxide in the world. I really disagree with Sophie, but in fact, the TfL numbers show that 60% of primary nitrogen dioxide on main roads in London, this is in tonnes per kilometre, come from diesel cars, 60%, and 20% from diesel vans. That's the transport for London.
So why is Oxford Street the most polluted street where cars are banned?
But 260 buses an hour.
Because
it's buses and taxis.
Well, it's buses and taxis.
But it's also due to where the monitoring stations are.
Main roads overall in London.
There's a couple of points there, though. Firstly, the vast majority of cars on the road today are not Euro 6 diesels, because they only were introduced from September 2015. So that resulted in a step change in terms of the technology available. The infrastructure was available to support the AdBlue dosing for the SCR system. So Euro 6 is a step change, an order of magnitude improvement. And I'm confident that our Euro 6 cars will, in real world testing, demonstrate significant improvements over where we were at Euro 5. And as we go forward into the real driving emission standards, it's another order of magnitude improvement again. So what we're talking about in terms of, and we've tested this and other people have independently tested this on our cars, the Euro 6 cars tested in real life situations are 80 milligrams per kilometre. They're achieving the Euro 6 standard in real world. Second point as well, we discussed the American standards being technology neutral, agnostic to technology. We are the only company that's been able to launch a diesel since Dieselgate in the US. We have gone to the Air Research Board, proved that our cars are clean, that they are low emitters of nitrogen dioxides and particulates. And in independent testing of those cars in the US market, they produce numbers in the sort of 20 milligrams per kilometre. So we are I say, step change in technology once we fitted SEO.
A couple of questions come in. Is electric, this is almost certainly for you, Ian, is electric vehicle development at risk if we can't sell diesels today? Surely we need to sell these cars to fund the clean technologies of tomorrow.
So there's a couple of risks if we don't sell diesel vehicles. Our company has said previously that it's a key part of funding the investment in the future, but also there's a significant impact on CO2. Europe has a global target of reducing CO2, and we are on a glide path to hit 120 grams per kilometre fleet average CO2.
And you have to as a company, don't you?
Absolutely.
So it's not just something for consumers, it's something for companies too. And for
All car companies by 2020 have to hit these targets.
Have to hit the target.
Yeah, and because 20% better CO2 from a diesel, if we lose that benefit, then it'll be even more difficult to achieve.
I'm not sure it is 20%. I mean, I'm not saying, you're wrong. I just don't think that's right. I do think you're wrong, yeah. Because, if you actually look at, you tell me about this. If you have two identical models and you put a petrol engine in one and the diesel engine that you would choose to put in another, allowing for the fact that you'd probably put in a bigger engine and maybe turbocharge it, is it really like for like, same model, going to be 20% less CO2, or is it just actually in a theoretical world where you put in a much smaller engine and didn't turbocharge it?
Yeah.
It depends on the type of driving, I think, and if it is longer distance motorway driving, it will be less CO2. If it's around town, it won't be.
And here's the thing, petrol engines produce more PM10s than diesel engines. So it's a hugely complicated subject. I'd just like quickly to ask you, Saman, about how we get cities to understand what transport planning does to emissions. Because if you look at London, 2003 congestion charge. Now, the amount of cars coming into London since 2003 has dropped by 15%. But pollution and congestion, as you always tell us, quite rightly, is at record levels. Now, how can this be?
Well, it's basically been due to two things. One is that the proportion of diesel vehicles, or diesel cars, for example, has gone from sort of 10% to 50%. But the other bit is that NO2 is a percentage of NOx. So the way that the particles have been burnt off is to put more NO2 in. And I think that's been a contributor. But let me give you an example of the sort of thing that needs to happen. I mean, I think we need a combination of three things. We do need leadership. In London, the mayor has got off to a good start, I would say. Not a great start, but he's got off to a good start. But we do need political leadership. We do need technology. And we do need lifestyle change where we have perhaps some more walking and cycling and public transport.
We need traffic to flow as well.
Does this also apply outside London? Is London, say, when you're doing your work, is London just on its own as an issue? Is it other cities? Is it country areas? How wide is it?
For clean air zones, where we exceed in the UK, it's mostly within the cities, because you both have the build-up of traffic emissions. So you have kind of the 50% emissions for a city in total, central London, that's from vehicles. And what you also have is those emissions are trapped in by buildings. But we have traffic throughout the country. We have traffic in very small villages. There's a road in Wales, for example, that has some of the highest nitrogen dioxide levels in the country because of traffic going past, and it's been caught going slowly. In traffic, in bypasses, for example. Yeah. So it's not just a London-based problem. I think we often talk about London and the monitoring stations. What we don't have in the UK is a fantastic monitoring stations system everywhere around. So we always talk about Oxford Street. And the reason we talk about Oxford Street and we talk about Brixton is because they have monitoring stations. And these are really, really expensive, several £100,000. And until we have proper personal monitoring, and there doesn't exist a great nitrogen dioxide portable centre, we're trying to build one so we can prove what the problem is. People aren't going to know. So anytime you're in traffic, there's generally a problem. Anytime you're in a city, there's generally a problem. If you're out in the middle of the countryside, you're okay, but there's no safe level of exposure.
But that's the point where traffic management has a role to play as well, because answering Quentin's question about London, fewer cars in central London since congestion charge, and congestion's worse. Why? well, there's more traffic calming, roads are narrowed, more road humps, etc. And all of those things can contribute.
And have contributed.
Indeed.
And made it to the worst levels we have ever seen. And that's no coincidence. 175,000 new private hire licenses, the cycling superhighway, and 8,000 diesel buses.
I mean, often the environment, is the people's environment as well. I remember giving evidence at the A11 public inquiry in Wymondham, and the Great Crested Newt reared its head. So there were a lot of objections to the Great Crested Newt. But the people of Wymondham, their environment, had all the 44-ton trucks going to Norwich, going through their front doors. Yeah. In the end, the Great Crested Newt was rehoused at the cost of £110,000, and they're doing extremely well. And the people of Wymondham got their bypass, so they were winners. But there were a lot of objections on those grounds.
Right.
I think one of the, this issue about Germany, and that's going to, obviously 2 weeks to go, it's interesting to see what's happening. So a few days ago, Angela Merkel said, look, we think that Britain and France are probably on the right track with banning diesel from 2040. She's kind of changed her position in the last couple of days. She's talking about being sort of technology neutral. And so she's obviously got a giant car industry to deal with, which has got, so she's trying to balance it. But I think what will happen with the momentum is that there is at the city level, there are 30 cities that she met with, 30 city mayors on Monday. And at that meeting, she doubled the amount of funds for Help Clean Air that she'd only announced a month before, from 500 million euro to $1 billion. So what you're seeing is a whole series of German cities threatening to go it alone. And that's why the momentum of the debate is going to be, there'll be breakouts. And so you've got even Stuttgart, which is the centre of two big car corporations, saying that they're going to be totally diesel-free. And you've also got Munich, which is BMW as well.
Does that render, Quentin, the 2040 ban pretty irrelevant?
I think the terrifying thing here is if we don't apply proper science to this, if we don't get the very, very, very best minds to understand what we should do to have this holistic approach and look at all these various sources of pollution, it won't make any difference at all. And it terrifies me when we're seeing responsibility for this devolve to local councils who, with the best will in the world, don't have that background information and expertise to be able to enact proper legislation and policies that will keep clean our air. So the 2040 cutoff date, I don't believe that's right. I think we should just allow technology to improve emissions as it will. So consumers will make a natural choice. It may happen before 2040, but as long as you could give them electric cars, and I've been an electric car driver for the last 7 years, electric cars that cost 10 grand and have 350-mile charge from one charge up with battery range, then they'll buy them. But until you get to that stage, they won't.
Simon?
I sit on the UN Environment Programme's steering group for the UN's 5-yearly report for the environment, and there are four things that I mention. The first is we need to think in terms of, I don't mention diesel. The first thing we need to do is think of one atmosphere, so we need to think of all of these problems together. The second thing is urgency, whether you're talking about air pollution in cities or climate, there is a real urgency that is needed here. We need to address, as I said before, include lifestyle changes as well as technology and political leadership. And the final one is the sort of governance type issues that we've touched on. But I think what we need more than anything else is a clean air revolution, like exactly the one we had in 1956, that banned coal and wood burning from the most polluted places and made us a world leader for 15 years.
Someone asked the question, emission standards for Euro 7 will be the same for diesel and petrol. Surely then we should stop picking on diesel.
Well, I can guarantee that in 5 years' time, if we were sitting here, we would certainly be talking a lot more about petrol. I think we talked in the previous session, I think people talked before about tyre and brake wear. I think you mentioned it yourself. So tyre and brake wear is another problem coming down the track. So let's not just think it's diesel in terms of the problems.
I think consumers are changing, though. In our latest AA Populist survey, 20,000 people saying, thinking about your next car, what will it be? diesel, I think, was only 16%, but hybrid, electric, plug-in hybrid had actually gone up to 28%. Now, it's only about 1 or 2% at the moment, 110,000 plug-ins. But I think people are slowly changing as companies like Jaguar Land Rover are bringing on stream better vehicles.
What we call the electric car today will just be the car tomorrow. Fundamentally, we will be looking at diesel hybrids, petrol hybrids, because there's a combination. The customers are demanding a choice. We can give them that variety, but fundamentally, diesel has a role to play in that because you do get better fuel consumption.
Can I just ask this question now, because it's come in and I don't understand it entirely, but it's probably worth asking. It's for you, Ian. What does the electrification of JLR vehicles mean for the Ingenium engines? What is an Ingenium engine? A lot of investment has gone into these engines.
Yeah, £1 billion.
So the Ingenium engine is our family. It's effectively our new family of 4-cylinder engines. So launched 2-litre diesel a year and a half ago, and this year launched the 2-litre petrol. So those are the Ingenium engine families. Electrification is supplementing those engines. So we're hybridizing those engine technologies in different ways. So absolutely, we see a future for the Ingenium engine and for the Wolverhampton manufacturing facility.
Right. So this move, and the move that was announced today with great fanfare on the Today programme, as it happens, which is, of course, the place you go to make a major announcement of any sort. That doesn't affect those engines and that investment.
Not at all. It's all part of
Writing
developing a portfolio of engines and a portfolio of powertrain.
It was very funny hearing the boss say, your boss say, when my colleague asked him about what he referred to as, I think, the old-fashioned internal combustion engine. He was very quick to say, it's not old-fashioned. It's absolutely still got a place in that hybrid future. Simon, you want to say something else?
Yeah, the electric infrastructure needs to be put in place. If I would encourage any of you to go along to a street called Trevor Street in Westminster. Westminster has installed 2 charging points, which, guess what, are in resident parking bays. You couldn't reach them if you had an electric vehicle because it's parked up with other vehicles. They'll no doubt say that this trial has been a failure. So we need to actually do something about that. I've talked to most of the big charging providing companies in London. They say that they will pay to put in the charging spots and obviously pay people then to use them if they're given some curbside space. So it is about allocating some curbside space to actually kickstart
It's
this
an interesting
process.
one, that, for governments, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we had this discussion when we were talking about the electric future and all the rest of it, this discussion about infrastructure and who pays, etc. And actually, we were told by the person, the civil servant in charge of that stuff at the moment, in fact, the money side of it isn't necessarily the issue, but at some stage, if you are going to be putting kit in the public realm.
Yeah, and it's also going to be complex negotiations with local governments. And so this is another area where cities can lead. I mean, we found in Australia with renewable energy that when we had a government, a conservative government that were climate change deniers, that the states said, we're going to do this ourselves. Yeah. And then eventually the national governments catch up. That's what's happening in Germany. It'll happen here as well. It'll be leadership from the cities.
Yeah.
Justin, sorry, just one quick point. I think I would be really grateful if somebody, an investigative journalist in the audience or online, would investigate whether petroleum industry companies, played a material part in the late 80s in pushing people into diesel. Because somebody in that industry, who better remain nameless, told me that they had done exactly that. And the reason was, guess what? Because heating oil sales went down, when natural gas went up, they had spare refining capacity. This is what the chap told me. And so they played a part.
I think there are a lot of culprits there, from green groups to governments to EU.
Some of them are prime ministers, yes.
Kyoto agreement.
I mean, when you look at it in the round, the idea of diesel from the perspective of existing drivers and possible future drivers, and we've talked a lot about myths and reality, And from Simon's perspective, it's the devil, we've got to stop, to other more nuanced perspectives of how it might exist over the next sort of couple of decades or so. Where are people now? I mean, where should and are the public on this? And probably
Well, I think part of it is they are confused because there have been so many mixed messages. And, if there's one thing...
But are they confused and going in a direction?
No, I think...
Or are we still at the level of people just throwing up their hands and not knowing what to think?
A lot of people are confused and worried because they hear about low emission zones. They don't really understand it. They hear about T charges and D charges. And frankly, that puts them off. And there are some people in that category that it shouldn't actually put off because they're not selecting the best option for how they drive. So it's that kind of confusion. But I think, there is a reality. We all want clean air. It's not that drivers are some lead heads who say, but they don't. We survey them all the time. We all want clean air. But it's got to be fair. And I think what people resent is the people who bought, the people carrying good faith, and they live in southwest London, who bought it in good faith. They do 1,500 miles a year, and now they're told they can't have that vehicle. And if they want to park it in Islington, they have to pay £96 a year more just to park it. So they're not spreading emissions.
People scratch coins down the side as well.
And their choices are so limited. They were told to buy diesel, and they made that choice, and they're now told that choice is wrong. If they surrender their diesel or petrol car now and buy an electric car, it means a complete change of lifestyle. And I know this because I drive one every day. And I could not drive down here today to London from Warwickshire without stopping halfway on the motorway for 45 minutes to charge, and then charging again in London, and then charging 45 minutes on the motorway on the way back. Now, today, right now, consumers will not be able to do that. And it's impossible for mainstream electrification because we just can't cope with it. The technology is not there yet. So to expect people to get out of their diesel and petrol cars right now is an act of really unfair, disingenuous optimism.
Which is why the move that's been announced today about going to hybrid, I think makes eminent sense until the electric technology catches up in an affordable way for real punters. I mean, my wife, was a member of the Australian Greens, not even my party, she bought a diesel car because she thought it was the right thing for the environment. Her sister bought a VW for the same reason. And there's not only confusion, there's real anger about deceit. And I think the problem that for decent car companies is what VW and I guess some others have done, have put the fact that people were lied to. And that's, I think, has done damage to good people improving a technology.
We have talked about diesel. We are now out of time. Once again, huge thanks to our panelists and to everyone, particularly those who asked questions. And we're going to take a break again. Thank you.